Hi, everybody. Crafting Journey. Welcome back to part 2 of the closing arguments of the retrial of Mark Jensen. Before lunch, we heard from the prosecution and the defense, and now we're going to hear the prosecution's rebuttal. Now, let me just check to see if what's going on in the courtroom. Okay, they're not back yet. Big surprise. But as soon as they come back, I will share my screen with you so that you guys can see the action live from YouTube. Okie doke. So I hope you enjoyed part 1. I know that I did. Hi, Kat. Welcome, welcome. There we go. Robin is back. Kat is back. I'm glad you guys are coming back for part 2. I think if it's Chamboys, which I think it is, Shirley Chamboys, it's going to be good because he is very, very passionate about this trial, about this case. He is a prosecutor who resigned his position at the state attorney's office, after a good career. And then he took a job with the Department of Transportation as their senior attorney. But they've hired him on as a special prosecutor to try this case. Hi, Mickey. Welcome, welcome. So yeah, I'm going to take them out until they're live. So he has come back to try this case. He's got the assistance of his wife. She sits right behind him. She's also a lawyer. And the lawyer that we heard that sits next to him is the assistant district attorney and quite qualified to do this case on her own. But she's doing it with Chamboys, who knows this thing inside and out. Hey, Nessa, welcome. Because he was there, in 2008 when he was the original prosecutor. Now, from time to time, I have seen the original defense attorney. He has been in the courtroom. He's been watching off and on. He's there in the audience. Not sure why. Maybe he does. Maybe he's retired now. Who knows? But he has a different defense team than he had in 2008. So we are waiting. I did release a 15-minute video, just a regular video that talks about the Alex Murdaugh case. So you got some of each from me today. Lots to watch while you craft. So you can get a lot of diamond painting done, or whatever craft it is you're doing. I just was going through some of my craft stuff, and I found a book that I bought and never even looked at, this crochet book. It's from Karen Cakes. I remember buying this. It was on clearance. It was $5, and I never looked at it. So I think I'm going to take a look and see if there's anything I want to crochet in here. I'm not crazy about Karen Cake yarn, but, I can use a different yarn. Oh, they have a cute little purse there. Oh, it's not a purse. It's a scarf with a pocket in it. Ooh, I should make that. Patch pocket shawl. Ooh, that would be cute. Huh. A beach tote. A poncho. I made that poncho last year and I didn't like it. I just don't look good in a poncho. I just look like huge. I don't know. Anyway, so that's the book. Okay. What's taking him so long? He gave him an hour and 15 minutes for lunch. I'm sure they're back. We're probably just waiting on the defendant, who had to go back and eat his peanut butter and jelly. They're only the best for the prisoners. How's everybody doing today? Kat, you're not working today? Is your day off? I switched to Diet Dr. Pepper. I'm done with the coffee. I had too much coffee this morning. Hi, Annette. How are you? Nice to see you. Oh my gosh. Fatal crashes in ice storm. Oh my goodness. We didn't get any ice here today, but this morning when I woke up, it was 6 degrees. I'm like, what? I'm not walking the dog today. Let me see what it is today. Oh, now it's up to 23 degrees. Yeah. It was cold this morning. Oh my God. So cold. And this afternoon, it doesn't look like it's going to be higher than 26 degrees today. But the sun is shining, so I might walk the dogs later. Okay, we're back in the courtroom. Let's listen in. As soon as the judge turns on his microphone. Oh, your baby sitting near Savannah. A brand new grandson. Oh, how sweet. You got to get him used to my voice, Kat. You know, introduce him to Crafting Journey. I lull children to sleep. All right. Turn on the mic, Judge. I don't think jury's in the courtroom yet either. Maybe that's what we're waiting for. They went to get the jury. Annette, I'm doing very good today because I'm staying warm. Yes. Please rise.
Please rise for the jury.
We turned on the microphone. Oh, I like her jacket. Isn't that adorable? Ooh, can I have that? I want that jacket. I don't have anywhere to wear it, but I like that jacket. That is super cute. It looks like a Talbot's, you know. This is the kind of things I like to talk about when I watch a trial. Looks like a Talbot's jacket or something you would find at Talbot's, which I haven't been into in years because I don't work anymore as an attorney, but I loved Talbot clothing when I was an attorney. Talbot and Ann Taylor were my go-tos. Yep, get your gum, Mark. Your breath fresh for the jury. Okay, I'm going to mute while we listen to the closing arguments.
All right, we're back on a record on Mark D. Jensen, 2002 CF 314. The appearances are the same. It is January 31st, 2023 in the afternoon. The jury has numbers and are seated different, and I will tell you why we're doing that later, but there is a reason for that. So with that, the state has to do their rebuttal. Anytime you're ready, Ms. McNeil. Oh, I'm sorry. Anytime you're ready, Mr. Jambois. Thank you, Robert.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, for paying such careful attention to this trial. And here we are today, 24 years, 1 month, 28 days after Detective Paul Ratsberg was called to the scene of what the evidence shows was the homicide of Julie Jensen. Now, you know, last night in preparation for what I knew was going to be my rebuttal, I watched the opening statements. I watched them on YouTube of the opening statement by Carly McNeil and the opening statement by Mackenzie Renner. And then I just watched the closing argument by Mackenzie Renner and the closing argument by Jeremy Perry. And I was struck by this point in Mr. Perry's closing argument where he said, he didn't want you to be responding to emotional appeals that cloud the evidence. I wrote it down, just to make sure I got it right. And I'm wondering, what could you be talking about? I mean, I watched Mackenzie Renner's opening statement, and I just watched her closing argument, and it was not an emotional appeal to cloud the evidence. If anything, it was a very clear-cut, detailed and I'd say somewhat dispassionate recitation of what the evidence was going to show in her opening statement and what it did show in her closing argument. And I was struck by the extraordinary similarity between her opening statement and her closing argument. In fact, I would say they were identical. And there's a reason for that. It's because in between the two was the evidence that was presented to all of you, and it was presented to you in exactly the way that Carly McNeil told you it would be presented to you, and it was presented to you in exactly the way she said it was presented to you in her closing argument. So if we're talking about emotional appeals, let's see, emotional appeals that cloud the evidence, the first thing that came to my mind was the defense opening statement. In fact, the opening lines by Mackenzie Renner, where she spoke of, and I can't quite emulate the tone of voice that she used, but it was like a broken tone of voice, like a distraught man, eyes red from crying, snot bubbling up from his grief, had troubles up. Well, I guess that was an emotional appeal, but it didn't cloud the evidence. It was just pure fiction, because you never heard any evidence like that, did you? I know you didn't. I was sitting here in the courtroom with you. There was no evidence of anything like that. In fact, they asked Dave, I forgot Dave's last name, but the paramedic who responded, who's now an assistant chief, and they asked him, well, do you know anything about defendant Mark Jensen? No, I just was going there to take care of the victim. And so he described to you the scene, the victim, her condition. There was no evidence at all of this, the opening couple of paragraphs in the defense opening statement. And there were other things in the defense opening statement that simply were never, there was no evidence presented to you. When they had the opportunity to present their evidence to you, they didn't present any evidence of any other person besides Mark Jensen, and at one point, or speaking of Julie being suicidal. DeFazio said she was not suicidal. Dr. Borman said she was not, did not appear suicidal. She was distraught. She was upset. There was no testimony from any witness here that Julie Jensen, that a other third part heard Julie Jensen talking about suicide. That was mentioned in their open statement, but when they had the opportunity to prove that to you, to present evidence of that, they didn't, did they? And then they also, during the course of their part of the case, if there's something important that they want you to know, that's when they're supposed to bring it out. Now, in his closing argument, Mr. Renner referred to this as being, I'm sorry, Mr. Perry, not Mr. Renner. Mr. Perry referred to this home computer as the second home computer. Where did that come from? Another thing that was just made up out of whole cloth. They asked David Jensen, wasn't this the second home computer? He said, no, not that he remembered. There was simply no evidence of this being the second home computer. And remember, there was testimony about how common it was to have a home computer in a residence in 1998. It was very, very, very unusual. In fact, Detective Ratsberg said this is the first time they'd ever seized a computer from a residence in the course of an investigation. So the emotional appeal, I don't know, maybe he was thinking I was going to do it. Maybe he was talking about my cross-examination of these hired guns that the defense brought in. The $22,815 testimony from Dr. Lindsay Thomas. The $10,000 to $15,000 testimony from Dr. Stacy Hale. And I don't know, the $10,000 plus testimony from Dr. West. because I did cross-examine those witnesses, and perhaps that's when he's talking about emotional. But you know, that was very directly connected to the evidence. Now, defense counsel also, in his closing argument, told you some things that the evidence just didn't support that proposition. Remember when he was talking to you about how the evidence showed that Mark Jensen could not possibly have been on the computer on December 2nd at 11:45 or 11:43 a.m.? And I'll ask Ms. McNeil if she could pull that up. Not his argument. We're not pulling up Mr. Perry's argument. We're pulling up the evidence about the use of the computer on December 2nd. And that evidence, when you see it come up, is going to show that the internet was used on the Jensen home computer at something in the neighborhood of 11:45 a.m. on November 2nd. He said, well, that's not possible. It's not possible that he could have been using the computer 11:45 a.m. or at whatever time it was because, he was picking up the prescription. Well, the evidence also showed when he picked up the prescription, and it was at 11:13 a.m. So first of all, here's the internet usage, and you can see 8:14 a.m. to 8:49 a.m. Well, he was saying, at 8:14 a.m. to 8:49 a.m., he was taking Douglas to preschool. Well, that's not true. There's no evidence that he was taking Douglas to the preschool at 8:14 to 8:49 a.m. And in fact, we know for a fact that he wasn't. You want to know how? We know that he was not taking Douglas to preschool at 8:14 to 8:49 a.m. because there he is on the computer at 8:14 to 8:49 a.m. And there's no evidence that Douglas was being transported to daycare at 8:14 to 8:49 a.m. other than what Mr. Perry said to you in his closing argument, and that's not evidence. Opening statements and closing arguments are not evidence, and I guess there's a good reason for that when you consider the opening statement by Mackenzie Renner when she's talking about the defendant's distraught condition on the morning or in the afternoon when law enforcement responded to the scene of Julie Jensen's murder. And then we can bring up, do you have the receipt or the record of the pickup of Ambien? It was 11:13 to 11:14 a.m. While she's looking for it, I can just tell you that's what it was, 11:13 to 11:14 a.m. Because I know the evidence in this case. Because it wasn't just Detective Ratsberg that responded on December 3rd, 1998. 24 years, 1 month, and 28 days ago. I was there too. You know, in his closing argument, Mr. Perry spent a good 40 to 50 minutes talking about Aaron Dillard and Ed Klug and talking about their credibility or his perception of their lack of credibility. But remember, when did they come into this case? In 2007. In 2007 is when Ed Klug and Aaron Dillard first came into this case. There's no indication the state had ever heard of either one of them before 2007. Yet when was this case issued? In March of 2002. So do you actually think the entire state's case hinges upon the testimony of two people we've never heard of, never seen? Obviously not. What do you suppose the evidence in this case actually does hinge upon? It hinges upon all this evidence that the defense counsel wants you to ignore. Now, there's been an unusual amount of discussion about penises, considering this is a homicide case. But you honestly think that we were talking about penises as a means by which to misdirect your attention away from the evil, unspeakably awful things that this man did to Julie Jensen? Do you really think that's the thing we wanted you to focus on? No. The reason that we talked about these penis photos and the astonishing collection and array of penis pictures on Mark Jensen's work computer that was recovered in 2002, it's not because we want to show you that he's got a strange and sick obsession with penises. It's because we wanted to show you that his strange and sick obsession with penises drove his behavior in the years of harassment of Julie Jensen. Now, think about what the defense theory of the case is here. That Perry Tarica, a man who you saw testify in this case, and who clearly loved Julie Jensen and described her to you as the finest, kindest woman he'd ever met. Now, did you get the impression that Perry Tarica's testimony was contrived? Or did you get the impression that Perry Tarica was telling you the God's honest truth about this woman that he loved? Do you honestly think, as you're sitting here right now, that any normally constituted human being, any normally constituted man, for 7 years after his girlfriend breaks up with him, for 7 years, he does hang-up call after hang-up call after hang-up call after hang-up call. For 7 years, he drops explicit pornographic photos off at the residence of Julie Jensen and at the office of Mark Jensen. Do you honestly believe that? That doesn't make any sense, does it? On the other hand, if you're dealing with a sadistic, narcissistic sociopath, which the evidence shows Mark Jensen is, then it makes perfect sense. Because you see, doing all these hang-up calls, the person who's doing it doesn't see the result. Dropping off these photos, the person receiving that person's Perry Tarica would not have seen the effect that it's having on Julie Jensen. The police saw it. The police saw how distraught and humiliated and embarrassed Julie Jensen was. And Mark Jensen saw it too. And Mark Jensen, when he'd get, as he put it, one of his few truthful statements to Detective Ratzberg, he told the truth in some instances to Detective Ratzberg. It was, as defense counsel referred to it, Mr. Perry referred to it in his closing argument. I wrote it down so I get it right. Blends facts with fiction. So who is blending facts with fiction? You know, part of this case, when you're looking at the way people were speaking about the case, and the way Mark Jensen was speaking about the case, you've got to look at the process in which this case unfolded. So when Mark Jensen was talking to Paul Ratzberg on April 21st, 1999, he'd never heard of Ed Klug. I mean, well, he'd heard of Ed Klug. He didn't know that we knew what Ed Klug was going to tell us. He didn't know that Ed Klug was going to come forward and tell the truth about that conversation on November 7th, 1998. So on April 21st, 1999, what Paul Ratzberg knew was pretty much only what Paul Ratzberg told him. Of course, in addition to what he did. So on April 21st, 1999, Mark Jensen knew how he killed Julie Jensen. Found out, Paul Ratzberg, what we knew about how Julie Jensen died. So he was blending fact with fiction. He had to disclose what he knew that we were going to find out. David was there with him. So he had to disclose that David said, well, yeah, she couldn't get out of bed, or David said she couldn't talk. She could not talk that more on the morning of December 3rd. So Mark Jensen was telling the truth about Julie Jensen's condition on the morning of December 3rd. Because he had to. He had to, because David was there with him. So he had to tell that much of the truth. And he did not know that we were going to later prove that at 9:42 a.m., somebody was on the computer looking up looking up antifreeze, ethylene glycol, and why isn't she dead yet? You know, what are the stages of ethylene glycol poisoning? He didn't know when he was talking to Paul Ratzberg on April 21st, 1999, that was information that Paul Ratzberg had already. And Paul Ratzberg didn't tell him that. So he told the truth. That on April 3rd, 1999, on December 3rd, 1998, on that morning, Julie couldn't get out of bed. He said it multiple times. Could you pull that up, Ms. McNeil? Answer, she couldn't get out of bed that morning. Answer, I mean, I'd hate to have it come to that, but you can ask David about mom's condition that morning. She couldn't get out of bed. He wanted to stay home because mom was sick. We did nothing, you know. There was no sexual thing going on that morning. And then later, well, she had to get up, get water. Answer, I brought it to her. Question, answer, she did not get out of bed. Question, so you did have some conversation. She asked you to get a glass of water. Answer, no, I got it for her. She had nothing to say. David, I mean, after that fact, I think she was giving me indications like nodding her head or something like that. But David said that she couldn't talk that morning. So you see, on April 21st, 1999, he was blending fact with fiction. So when he was confronted about Kelly Labonte, she's just, she's the secretary for Scott McQuay. Girlfriend, no, she's not my girlfriend. And then when he starts showing the emails, just, you mean that, Kelly? Oh, yes. Well, then, yes. Okay, now, yes, now on April 21st, now, yes, you could say that. But even it was very difficult to get a straight answer out of this guy who was blending fact with fiction. And do you think it's because he was too stupid to understand the question, or do you think he was smart enough not to answer it? Blending fact with fiction is Mark Jensen's pièce de résistance. It's his calling in life, to mix fact with fiction. So take the fact of Julie Jensen's one weekend affair with Perry Tarica in 1991, and then build the fiction around it, that Perry Tarica is doing all these hang-up phone calls, but that's not enough. Eventually, he's got to make it better. He's got to make it more humiliating, because he's sadistic. The evidence shows that he's sadistic. And what means did he have by which to perpetuate the sadistic plan that he had? Well, he had a seemingly endless array of penis photos on his computer and a seemingly endless array of fellatio pictures on his computer. He had an endless stock of pornography that he could use to humiliate and demean Julie Jensen with for years and years and years. And that's the mark of a sadist, a controlling, manipulative sadist. And then you have Turtle. It looked like an email from Turtle to Julie Jensen. That's the email that he showed her with these disgusting, revolting photos. And by the way, talk about somebody being bought and paid for. Consider the testimony of Dr. West. She wouldn't even acknowledge that, this 36-page record of harassment that was maintained by Julie Jensen at the request of a law enforcement officer. Dr. West could not even bring herself to acknowledge that that's a form of harassment or that's evidence of harassment. Couldn't even bring herself to acknowledge that Turtle to Julie email with those disgusting, revolting photos on it. She couldn't even bring herself then to agree that was harassment. So maybe I got a little bit upset with Dr. West, because I think when people get on the witness stand, they're supposed to tell the truth, no matter how much they're paid to disguise it. So Dr. West, with her lofty degrees and her forensic psychiatry specialization, and Siggy caps, and you remember Dr. Hale laughed at me when I said Sige caps. Well, I apologize to you, ladies and gentlemen. I mispronounced Siggy caps. But I knew what the first letter of Siggy caps was. It's an S. And what does it stand for? It stands for sleep. The very first thing, the Siggy caps, the very first thing for analyzing depression with a patient is to talk about sleep disorders. And don't you think that Dr. Borman, a board-certified family practitioner with years and years of experience, and he said many patients who came to him with depression, in fact, he talked about Siggy caps. So don't you think he talked about sleep? He did. He said he did. And he said he made no notes of any kind of sleep abnormality or sleep problems with Julie on either September 21st or on December 1st. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can look at his notes. Of course, good luck reading them, but you can consider his testimony. He never said anything about any sleep disorder. And yet, what did Dr. West say about Siggy caps? Oh, yes, Julie Jensen had a sleep problem. Well, where did that come from? Well, Dr. Borman's notes. Well, that was Dr. Borman's notes from December 2nd when he was talking to Mark Jensen. So it was Mark Jensen was the origin of her sleep disorder, not Julie Jensen, not Dr. Borman. It all came from Mark Jensen. But she just could not acknowledge, well, no, that came from Mark Jensen. No, she just couldn't say that. No, it was in Dr. Borman's notes, therefore it came from Dr. Borman, even though the evidence is absolutely, positively, unequivocally clear that all of that information about sleep problems came from Mark Jensen years and years and years after he'd been with this offense. She interviewed Mark Jensen for 5 hours. And the other guy, Dr. Herzl Spiro, whom you didn't hear for, but she read his report, he'd interviewed him for 14 hours. Now, what do they teach in these psychiatry courses where you can become, where you get board certified as a forensic psychiatrist when you completely ignore the evidence? When you consider the prime suspect in a first-degree murder, that's the best source of information, most reliable source of information you're going to get about the condition of the victim in the months preceding her death? It's Mark Jensen and Laura Koster. It's all Laura Koster. You heard Laura Koster testify. And you heard the testimony about what Laura Koster had truly actually said to Julie Jensen about a week and a half before she died. Because you heard Ted Voigt testify about it, and you heard Teresa Fazio testify about it. And what did Ted Voigt say? Ted Voigt indicated that Julie told him that Laura had told Julie, I lived with him after Julie had shown him this Post-it note, Laura Koster told Julie, I lived with him for 18 years. You have no idea what he's capable of. Now, Laura Koster denies making that statement, but she didn't deny living with him for 18 years. So what had the ring of truth to it? And then Laura Koster denies calling Paul Ratzberg crying and upset sometime around December 4th or December 5th saying, I think my brother killed my best friend. Well, how many brothers did Laura Koster have? And how many best friends did she have? So didn't Detective Ratzberg's testimony have the ring of truth? You know, there are many little things about this. There are so many little things. Take Dave Nearing. Dave Nearing testified that Mark was complaining to him about how he wanted his computer back, his home computer back. This is on a Friday afternoon. And Dave Nearing said, well, you should be happy they didn't take your work computer. And what happened the following Monday? Do you remember what happened the following Monday? Dave Nearing comes to work and Mark Jensen approaches him and says, oh, my computer's fried. I have a new computer. Now, at some years earlier, Dave Nearing also recounted a conversation when Mark Jensen indicated that you could fry a hard drive on a computer by putting a magnet over it. Now, defense counsel made much of that. They're examining Jason Ruffalo. You can't destroy a computer that way, can you? Take a 4,500-pound computer or something. Well, it's not like we said that you can destroy a hard drive that way. Mark Jensen said it, so he was wrong. That's what he said. Because Dave Nearing has no motive to lie to you. Dave Nearing had no motive to lie to you about the time on December 3rd, 1998, when Mark Jensen said he was at work, and Dave Nearing said he wasn't, and Meredith Perez said he wasn't. The people that were at work who testified in this case on December 3rd said Mark Jensen was not there. I think Rose McGinnis said that too. Everybody that testified who was at work on December 3rd, 1998, in the Racine office of Stifel Nicholas said Mark Jensen was not there, which is a rather inconvenient fact since that's Mark Jensen's alibi for about the time that Julie Jensen was murdered on December 3rd, 1998. In the closing argument, defense counsel made much of saying Julie used the internet. Well, of course, here's the problem with that assertion. There is not one whit of evidence in this case that Julie ever used the internet, not one whit. In their opening statement, they said, well, there was internet usage on this date when Mark was at work and Julie was at home. Well, remember Jason Ruff testified about that. No, that actually wasn't internet usage. That was the computer updating itself. There's certain things that update themselves. He said it was something that would take 1 to 2 seconds, and the computer would do that itself. There was simply no evidence that this computer was used when Julie Jensen was home alone. When Mark Jensen was off to his blueprint on November 5th, 6th, and 7th, the computer was not used at all. Now, defense counsel said Julie never told anybody about being sick the weekend that Mark was away at the Blueprint conference. Well, again, sometimes you hear these closing arguments from defense counsel, you wonder if they've been sitting in the same courtroom. Now, acknowledge it's a long trial, but you all saw and heard Ted Voigt's videotape testimony, where Ted Voigt specifically, unequivocally indicated that 2 to 3 weeks before Julie died, she told him that she'd gotten sick. And so she was afraid that Mark was trying to poison her. So she was afraid to eat or drink anything around the house. I'm not making that up. You saw it yourself. You saw it on the screen. Some of you looked at that screen, some of you looked at that screen, but you all heard to testify of Julie being sick 2 or 3 weeks before she died, and how she was afraid to eat or drink anything because she was afraid that Mark was trying to poison her. And by the way, might that explain some weight loss? If you're afraid to eat or drink anything around the house because you're afraid your husband's trying to poison you? There were no searches on the internet for divorce. Well, there are a couple of reasons for that. Number one, Julie didn't use the internet. Number two, she already had a divorce attorney. Remember, she'd filed for divorce in 1990 or 91. I think it was 91. So she already knew who her divorce attorney was going to be. She didn't need to look it up, even if she could, and there's no evidence that she could. But the guy who wanted to run off with his girlfriend on the Windstar cruise, the guy who was having sexual relations with Kelly Labonte or Kelly Greenman, and then I think during most of this relationship, when it started in September, she was Kelly Labonte. when it continued by October 1st. I mean, she'd just gotten back from her honeymoon. Using sex with him. Chicago 4 days. She was killing him. There was no evidence that Julie Jensen used the internet. And here's the other thing about Julie using the internet. If Julie used the internet, don't you think he'd know about it? If Julie used the computer, don't you think he'd know about it? And if Julie used the computer and he knew about it, do you honestly think he'd have internet exchanges between him and his girlfriend? Let's run off somewhere. Let's do a Windstar cruise. I do love you. I miss you. I want you. Do you think that would be on his home computer if Julie used the computer? Now, defense counsel also said in his closing argument, well, no, we're not saying that Julie was framing Mark for murder while committing suicide. We're just saying she committed suicide. Well, the problem with her just committing suicide is that the evidence is plainly and unequivocally contrary to that. Let's start with what Julie said. Julie was telling her next-door neighbor, her confidant, Ted Voigt. She was telling her third grade teacher, and she was telling her best friend, Laura Koster, that she was concerned that Mark was trying to kill her, or was trying to poison her, or he was trying to make it look like he was doing that so she'd do something that would make her look crazy. That's what she confided to Ted Voigt. That's what she confided to Laura Koster. That's what she confided to Teresa Fazio. Isn't that kind of inconsistent with a suicide? And of course, Dr. West explains everything away because, she had a distorted perception of reality. Well, Dr. West, how do you know she had a distorted perception of reality? Well, because she thought her husband was trying to kill her. Well, doctor, what if he was trying to kill her? Or what if she had reason to believe he was trying to kill her? Well, that was because of her distorted perception of reality. You see the circular reasoning there? Maybe you can see how I was starting to get upset with Dr. West and the nonsense and the BS that she was trying to feed you. So she's looking at this thing, this major depressive disorder. First S in Siggy Caps is for sleep, and the only evidence of sleep disorder comes from Mark Jensen years after Julie's been murdered. Oh, and then what about I? What was the I in Siggy Caps? Anybody remember? It was interest. Interest. According to Dr. West, who was paid to review this case. Remember, she was paid to do this. She was paid a lot of money to do this. A lot of money. And what did she see about interest? Yeah, well, there was no evidence one way or the other about that. That's not true. Because you heard testimony from Marion Passetti. You saw her on the television screen. She testified at the last hearing. Remember, she said that you called her on November 30th. Julie called Marion Passetti. And what did she call her about? Something about which Julie had a profound level of interest. Gardening. Julie wanted to know what Marion Passetti's information, what Marion Passetti could tell her about how Marion Passetti had such a beautiful garden early in the spring. And so Marion Passetti was telling her all about how you get these seeds in the early winter, and then you get potting soil, and you set it up in your basement, and you get sun lamps, or these black lamps that provide sunlight, and you start your garden in the basement. So Julie was asking Marion Passetti very detailed questions about this. Marion Passetti said that conversation lasted 20 minutes to a half hour on November 30th, 1998, the day before Julie went to see Dr. Borman. So the day before Julie went to see Dr. Mormon, and 4 days before she was dead, Julie Jensen was talking with her friend, her neighbor, about having a detailed conversation about setting up her winter garden so that she could have early spring garden. But Dr. West didn't see anything significant. She didn't know about that, apparently. And if she had, well, of course, Dr. West could explain away anything that was inconsistent with suicidal intent, because under suicidality, she had admitted there was no evidence of suicidality. She admitted that. Julie never told anybody she was going to commit suicide. Julie had never attempted suicide. Julie had never made any plan for suicide. Any plan for her two boys that were everything to her. Her plan, apparently the defense theory is that Julie's plan was she'd leave the children in the care of the man who she believed was trying to kill her or make her look crazy. Julie had no suicide plan. She had never attempted suicide. She never talked about suicide to anybody at all. Mark Jensen also talked to Paul Griffin. And again, remember, we're talking about blending fact with fiction? Well, I shouldn't say that. We're talking, Mr. Perry talked about blending fact. And if you look at the lead up to the point where Mark Jensen was charged with first-degree murder, that's what he was doing with everybody he talked to outside the family. When he was talking with Paul Griffin on February 24, 2000, this is Mark said about December 2nd. Right. The night before, the night before was when I think it was the night we had macaroni and cheese, and we made that, and I botched that. She wasn't even awake much. I mean, she was in bed the whole time. I don't think she was sleeping most of the time. I think the kids were being quiet not to wake her. I mean, there was some conversation that night, but she was pretty much out of it. That was Mark Jensen's description to Paul Griffin of Julie Jensen on about how her condition on December 2nd. And he said that on February 24th, 2000. And then what did Mark Jensen say in his blending fact with fiction about December 3rd? He told Ratsburg, David stated he observed his mother breathing very heavily and had labored breathing the morning before her death. David stated he told several friends about this as well. David asked his dad the morning of December 3rd if his mother needed to go to the hospital. His dad said no. However, if she was worse later in the day, they would take her to the hospital. David said it was too late as they returned home and they found her dead. David said his mother was not eating. However, she was drinking a lot of water. And then the defendant's interview, page 71. She couldn't get out of bed that morning. You can ask David. She couldn't get out of bed. He wanted to stay home because mom was sick. She was in bed asleep. And then page 82. There was a question between myself and the kids that morning whether or not to call an ambulance, take her to the hospital, and the kids wanted to stay home. Her breathing was funny. She could hardly get out of bed. I mean, it was a god-awful situation. The bruising probably came from her getting up. I didn't hit her. She got up and she fell. She hit her head. I remember her telling me that. She got up to go to the John. And then at page 89, from 6:30 in the morning, she was not able to get out of bed. I mean, she was groggy, almost incoherent. Breathing was very labored, raspy. David tells me we talked about it. David tells me that I was holding her up, supporting her. Page 119. He had to bring her water. She couldn't even go to the John. David said she couldn't talk that morning. Page 138. She didn't get out of bed. She had a hard time breathing and could barely move on her own from 6:30 on. Blending fact with fiction. The fact that Mark Jensen knew he had to disclose because David was right there with him for this April 29th interview. And then the phone call that Mark Jensen had with Paul Griffin on January 9th, 2000. Mark, I didn't even hear her talk Thursday. How to describe it, to have it make sense to you. Her breathing was labored, kind of wheezy. She was cognizant of what you were telling her. She was weak by Thursday. I doubt she could have, if she could have got out of bed, it would have been crawling. Blending fact with fiction on April 21st, 1999, before Mark Jensen knew that we had computer evidence that we recovered from his computer establishing that at 9:42 a.m. on December 3rd, 1998, somebody was looking up the late stages of ethylene glycol poisoning, unconsciousness, loss of consciousness, so forth. How to explain that? How to explain that when she couldn't get out of bed? Well, there is no explanation for it. That's consistent with the defendant's innocence. The only explanation for that is Mark Jensen was continually upset that Julie wasn't dying quickly enough. Here he gave her this antifreeze on the evening of December 1st. He was hoping she'd be dead by the morning of December 2nd, and there she was still alive. And he woke her up, and he was saying, or she woke him up, and she was dizzy and drunk. She said, feeling drunk, and she needed an explanation for that. So he needed something to cause her to sleep through the poisoning. And so he went to see the doctor on December 2nd. And Julie thought, we know this because Julie told Margaret Voigt. Julie called her friend Margaret Voigt on the morning of December 2nd. And Julie was happier than she'd been in weeks or months. Here she was desperately sick, desperately ill. Very uncomfortable, very, very uncomfortable. But because of her, Mark was being good to her. Mark got the boys off to school. Julie was finally getting what she'd been looking for. She's up with the house instead of this narcissistic thug that she was actually married to. She thought Mark loved her. And when we went back to the doctor, he showed again how much he loved her by giving her the Ambien pill that the doctor had prescribed for her, and giving her another half a dose of paroxetine, and, helping her wash it down with orange juice and antifreeze. What a loving husband. Didn't she have reason to be happy on December 2nd, 1998 at 10 a.m.? She'd been lulled into believing that this monster that she was married to was finally showing her a little bit of love. That's what the evidence showed in this case, ladies and gentlemen. And you know he's guilty. Thank you.
Now, members of the jury, the duties of counsel in the court have been performed. The case has been argued by counsel. The court has instructed you regarding the rules of law which should govern you in your deliberations. The time has now come when the great burden of reaching a just, fair, conscientious decision of this case is to be thrown wholly upon you, the jurors, selected for this important duty. You will not be swayed by sympathy, prejudice, or passion. You'll be very careful and deliberate in weighing the evidence. I charge you to keep your duty steadfastly in mind as upright citizens to render a just and true verdict. The verdict submitted. The following two forms of verdict will be submitted to you for your consideration concerning against the defendant, Mark D. Jensen. One reading. We, the jury, find the defendant Mark D. Jensen guilty of intentional homicide of the first degree as charged in the information. The other reading, the jury, find the defendant Mark D. Jensen not guilty. It is for you to determine which one of the forms of verdict submitted you will bring in as your verdict. This is a criminal, not a civil case. Therefore, before the jury may return a verdict which may legally be received, the verdict must be reached unanimously. In a criminal case, all 12 jurors must agree in order to arrive at a verdict. When you retire to the jury room, select one of your members to preside over your deliberations. The presiding juror's vote is entitled to no greater weight than the vote of any other juror. If you need to communicate with the court while you are deliberating, send a note through the bailiff, signed by the presiding juror. To have a complete record of this trial, it's important you communicate with the court only by a written note. If you have questions, the court will talk with the attorneys before answering, so it may take some time. You should continue your deliberations while you wait for an answer. The court will answer any questions in writing or orally here in open court. When you have agreed upon your verdict, have it signed and dated by the person you have selected to preside. After you have reached a verdict, the presiding juror will notify the bailiff that a verdict has been reached. Everyone will return to the courtroom. The verdict will be read into the record in court. The court may ask each of you if you agree with the verdict. At this time, we'll swear in the bailiffs if they all could come in front of the clerk.
Do you swear that you will, to your utmost of your ability, keep all the jurors sworn on this trial together in some private and convenient place, subject to the direction of the clerk, and if agreed on the verdict or discharged by the court, and that you will not, before they render their verdict, communicate to any person the statement of deliberations or the verdict agreed upon, so help you God?
I do. All right, the record reflect the bailiffs were sworn in. All right, I have one more duty before we can start the deliberations, and it's a difficult one. All 16 of you have shown up on time. We're in the fourth week. Sometimes the weather wasn't pleasant. I gave you short lunches. We had a lot of videos to watch. So it's difficult for me to say this. 4 of you cannot deliberate. And it's all random. You all have your numbers. We're just going to use the numbers. The other thing I have to tell you, the 4 that cannot deliberate, you are not excused yet, because there could be an issue in the future, and it's leading into it now. We might have to consider you for something. So the 12 that are picked will deliberate in the back. The other 4 will be in another room, and we will tell you where you have to go. So let's do the random picking by numbers. Number 3. You know, no, 3. Number 4. 6. 6. One more.
Number 5.
Number 5. Okay, have all 16 walk out in the back all together, please. Joe. Of the courtroom. If we have questions, my policy is to bring all the lawyers back and the defendant. So you can't be far close, but you have to leave a number with the clerk so we can call you. And I usually make a copy of the question for both lawyers, and they can view it before we decide what to do.
Your Honor, one question, and that is with respect to the 4 alternates they weren't given any instructions as to what they could do aside from staying in that one room.
They're not going to do anything.
Well, but did you tell them they're not going to deliberate among the four of them?
We're going to have a bailiff with them in that room.
Oh, I want to.
We're not going to have two verdicts.
I understand that, Your Honor. What I wanted to make sure of is this. I mean, I don't know what the defense is going to do in this unlikely event that we need to get one of those jurors. And so I want the record to be clear that the four alternates are going to be instructed to stay in a room and they can talk about anything they want, except they can't talk about the case.
We will tell them that.
Thank you. Is that
have my word
defense
on that.
counsel agree with that?
Any objection? Yeah. And I'm not going to give them their phones either. So they're not going to be able to surf anything.
Okay. Cruel and unusual punishment.
I will do it. Okay, but make sure you give the phone number to the clerk. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, so that was the closing arguments in the antifreeze case. If you missed part one, you can go back and watch part one. You'll hear the prosecution's closing and the defense closing. What you heard on part two is the rebuttal argument by Mr. Chamboys, who's clearly been way too close to this case, if you ask me. He's just way too involved. You know, he was present at the crime scene in 1998 as the state attorney back then, and now retired, is still involved, is heavily involved in this case. I'm sure his wife is wishing that the whole thing would get over with and they could enjoy their retirement. Anyway, I will go live if the jury comes back with a verdict. Not if they have a question, because it's kind of hard to do that each time. But if they come back with a verdict, I will go live. I don't anticipate, it's already almost 3:00. They've got a lot of stuff to talk about. Unless they go in and they all raise their hand and say guilty, and then they're like, done. But stranger things have happened. All right. So hopefully that's all you're going to hear from me today, but you never know. I got some errands to run. Thank you all for coming and watching with me. And I got some diamond painting done, as you can see. And who said they bought? Oh, Purple Bookshelf Classic bought a diamond painting. She's addicted. Good for you. Good for you. I'm glad you're enjoying it. All right, guys, I will see you tomorrow in Crafting and Crime Daily. I did put up a short daily video today to talk about the Murdaugh case. So check that out. Take care, everybody. Bye.